Hello, and welcome to the 7th episode of Planet and the People, the podcast that explores the many different facets of climate change and how we protect our planet. I've decided to take my microphone out once again for a stroll in the Hampshire countryside on this beautiful June morning. Lockdown measures are starting to ease off. Well, we'll see what the results of that are over the next few weeks. Now, this is in fact the final episode of this first series of Planet and the People, and so far we've explored some of the many different elements of climate change, the problems and also the potential solutions, from food systems to alternative resources, technologies, reforestation, deforestation. And today I wanted to explore the thing that arguably in many ways binds all of these elements together, and that is economics. Now, do not fear, do not yawn and switch off at the mere mention of that word, because I actually had a really fascinating and enlightening conversation with climate change economist Dimitri Zenghelis. Dimitri has spoken at numerous TED Talks. He was originally head of economic forecasting at the Treasury before he moved into climate change and sustainability, and was one of the lead authors of the Stern Review back in 2006, which explored the economics of climate change. So we had a conversation about what a green economy would look like and how we could potentially build back a green recovery in the aftermath of this current crisis. So, without further ado, I will pass you over once more to my past self and Dimitri Zenghelis. Hi Dimitri, thank you very much for chatting to me. Yeah, I would like to talk about the economy, really. And I suppose right now we are in the midst of a global pandemic with the world's economies in turmoil. And the big question on lots of people's minds are, how do we build back our economy and how do we build it back to be a green, sustainable economy? So I would like to ask you what your thoughts are on that. But first of all, can I ask a little bit about you and who are you?
Who am I? I often wonder. Well, thanks very much for having me on here. So my name is Dimitri Zenghelis. I'm a climate change economist. I used to work originally I was a sort of bog standard macroeconomist. I worked at the Treasury as head of economic forecasting for almost a decade, and then I moved to work on something which is far more interesting and important, which is the economics of climate change. As one of the authors lead authors of something called the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, which is now almost more than a decade old. But I've been working on issues relating to how we assess climate change, but also importantly, how we manage it. What does it mean in terms of innovation and productivity and growth and jobs? And indeed, whether growth is really the key metric we should be looking at, or should we be looking broader measures of our prosperity?
Yeah, because one of the things that I remember you saying, so there is a conception that fighting climate change means limiting ourselves, going backwards, stopping economic growth. But you've often said quite the opposite.
There's much more to life than growth, and there's no denying that. But it's really important to recognize that growth doesn't have to be, and indeed isn't, about material things. This is the mistake that's often made. Growth is about much more than material things. So if we can find a way to grow and prosper whilst using fewer and fewer materials and emitting less and less carbon, then that's clearly a preferable way to develop, to get millions of people out of poverty, but also to generate the funds to put back into innovation in order to be cleverer in the way we use resources. Because really innovation is the key to this. It's about resource efficiency. It's about getting more out of the resources we have without polluting the environment. And that requires innovation. The problem is that we've not steered that innovation and we've not induced it. And if you don't do that, people, businesses, governments just carry on doing things the way they've always done things. And sort of history and inertia takes over. And we just don't have time for that, because carrying on doing things the way we've been doing it is, we are able to see, hugely dangerous in terms of opening ourselves up to not just climate risk, but we're also seeing resilience to pandemics. It's also unequally distributed. It's not inclusive. It's increasingly seen as undermining the social fabric and the social contract that allows people to feel that they trust their institutions and their governments to manage the economy for them. So we're really in a difficult spot now. We have an opportunity to, as you say, to build back better.
Yeah. I want to ask actually a little bit. I'm going to say the word Copenhagen to you, because you mentioned Copenhagen in a few of your talks as an example of infrastructure. So tell me about the Copenhagen example.
So you mean Copenhagen the city, not Copenhagen the climate talks?
No, not the climate talks.
Well, Copenhagen, you mentioned cities. Cities are crucially important. They are where most of us live. Half the planet lives in cities. By, within the next 30 years, 3/4 of the planet will be living in cities. It's where all the growth is. And if we lock into bad infrastructure, carbon and resource-intensive infrastructure in cities, then we're going to have absolutely no hope of meeting our carbon and resource targets. And it's going to be a very difficult planet that we bestow to our not only to our grandchildren, but to our children as well. The ideal city is one that's compact and connected, so people can meet and innovate and think about dematerializing the economy, because cities are very much based on innovation-led growth rather than material-led growth. People tend to have fewer cars. They use public transport. They walk more. It's much more efficient to connect buildings to broadband, to heat, to electricity, to sewage, than if people are living in sprawling suburbs or in the countryside and have to use their car to go everywhere and have to be connected separately. So cities are immensely efficient entities. It's what economists call agglomeration economies. Now, the problem with agglomeration economies post-corona is they're about bringing people close together. And so we have this very difficult challenge right now about the need to bring people close together, but also the need to keep people far apart.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this in London at the moment, where transport for London is really struggling. The wrong response to this is to say, well, transport for London's not going to get the revenues because it's not going to get the passengers. So it needs to kind of cut back on its modernization and capacity program. Because if it does that, of course, there'll be fewer trains, which will be more crowded, which means more people will leave the underground, which will mean there'll be less revenues, which means you'll have to cut back investment. And before you know it, you've got the death spiral of public transport and everybody's gone back to their cars. And we're seeing anecdotal evidence in China of people abandoning public transport in favor of cars, buying new cars, and wanting to live in sprawling suburbs rather than in efficient, walkable and cyclable city centres like Copenhagen. Copenhagen's very good. It's a dense city, but it also has these ribbons of rail infrastructure. So everybody's close to public transport, and you can put bikes on trains and you can access places without having to worry about pollution and congestion to the same extent that you have in less well-planned cities.
And you mentioned before about the cycling in Copenhagen.
So, as I said already, when it comes to cities, you want to make sure that you lock into low carbon, resource efficient infrastructure, because this infrastructure is going to last for 10, 20, 30 and more years. In London, we still have underground stations. If you go to Bank, you hear this very famous Mind the Gap announcement. People don't know the reason for that. And the reason, I'm told by those who do know, is that the public roads in London were originally designed by Romans, who, kind of contrary to their reputation, didn't build very straight roads, at least not in cities. They built winding, curving roads. And so when the tube lines were built, in order to not to pay rent to private landlords, they were built along public roads. And because those public roads were bent, then on stations like Bank and other stations on the underground, the trains don't align with the platform, so you get these gaps. So you need an announcement saying mind the gap. That is the legacy of decisions made 2,000 years ago by Romans, and we're still living with it in London.
So the tube lines are based on old Roman roads.
A lot of the main roads in London are old Roman roads. Yeah, Oxford Street, and they're all Roman roads. So you've got, and indeed, a lot of the shape of the skyscrapers you see in the City of London are based on road plans, which are way too old to account for kind of trading room floors. So they're these odd, quite interesting, architecturally quite interesting shapes. Again, because of planning decisions made in Roman times. So decisions we make on urban infrastructure last for decades, centuries in some cases. But it's not just about the physical stuff. It's also about, as I said already, behavior and institutions. And they tend to follow each other in lockstep. If you build stuff with bricks and mortar, people will adapt their behavior accordingly. And this is the example in Copenhagen, but it applies equally to Amsterdam or any other city with cycling infrastructure. When you ask people, why does everybody cycle? You very often, they look at you as if you're a bit slow to ask such a question, and they'll answer kind of slightly incredulously, well, of course, we have amazing infrastructure, just look around you. And then you follow up, I think very reasonably, by saying, okay, but how come you've got this great infrastructure here? At which point they really do think you're a bit slow on the uptake, and they look at you and they say, well, it's because everybody here cycles.
Yeah.
And you sort of walk away a bit confused, but then you realize very quickly that it doesn't really matter which came first, the chicken or the egg. The important point is, once you build the infrastructure, people will use it, or if people demand the infrastructure, it will be built. And then once it's there, you change behavior in a way that has a lasting legacy. So cities are both this kind of very kind of dangerous entities because they can be built badly and have a horrible historical echo that makes it very difficult to contain climate change and live within our resource envelope, or they can be built in a way that absolutely cements the changes in behavior and in the innovation in technologies that allow us to live sustainably.
I want to ask a little bit about food systems and your thoughts on food systems, because I had a few episodes actually, where we talk about food. And of all of the problems, it does seem to be one of the hardest to crack because of the complexity of supply chains. And we can all be high-minded and we can choose the higher standards of food certification and go organic and promote sustainable foods. But fundamentally, it is still cheaper if you are a single parent on a low income to give your children a bag of frozen chicken nuggets than choose a sustainable food option. So how can we create an economy that makes it easier and cheaper to choose sustainable food?
It's a really good question, and it's a question that's obviously kind of even more pertinent now in the light of Covid-19, where people are aware of the problems of supply lines that aren't resilient and that are fragile, and of course that tends to presuppose that we need to have a much more self-sufficient circular economy based on local production, which doesn't rely on some of these more fragile supply lines. But one needs to be very careful, because independence does not mean security, whether it's medical supplies or food or energy. We are more secure if we're interconnected with the rest of the world. If our energy system fails, you can get it through an interconnector under the channel. If you're hit by storms from climate change and your food supplies are ravaged by flood or drought, you can import food. And we're seeing already the importance of importing medical supplies at the time of a pandemic. So we need to retain some supply lines, but we need to again be clever about the way we do it. In terms of food, there is a tension between self-sufficient and humane agriculture and pressure on land. Now, there are many ways you can use that you can farm much better, get more out of the soil without destroying and depleting its nutrients. But we also need to move towards innovation whereby, you don't need to have a country of 60 million people being fed predominantly with chicken that is grown in conditions which are, unethical, but, at scale efficient. And for that, I think you need to move on to, people can change their diets, of course, that's hard to do. But maybe a better route will be to grow meat or meat alternatives in the lab.
Right.
Now, it sounds a bit odd to us. I've tasted some of this alternative meat, and it's absolutely delicious if you want to.
As in, it's grown in it's not sort of meat substitute like corn.
Well, so there are very sophisticated vegetable substitutes, and there are also for those, because there'll be some people who'll never change their ways, and even when you're growing meat in a lab, there'll always be a sort of underground market for the real thing. But if you can get the majority of people to be able to buy something that's as tasty as what you eat at the moment, but competitive on price, I think people will buy it. Yeah, there'll be resistance at first, but I don't think it will last too long if it's tasty, if it looks good and it's affordable.
Is there something, because a lot of sustainable food systems seem to be promoting a very traditional farming approach with rotations and pasture and less about feedlots for animals. And that might alarm quite a lot of people because it sounds science, it sounds laboratory, chemically.
Well, it does, and that's right. And if we can move everybody away from eating meat towards veganism, that would be great too. Although you'll need more land potentially to grow more vegetables, but that can be done, and you can create protein in ways that are more. I think that's absolutely fine, but it's the reality at this stage of acknowledging that a lot of people, and in particular a lot of people who aren't so worried about sustainability, will continue to want to eat some kind of cheap meat-related product. It doesn't have to be sort of science fiction done in a lab, although that's not that difficult, nor that sort of, it doesn't require huge amounts of genetic modification. But again, that's a debate I don't necessarily want to get into. But not least because I'm not an expert. But I do know that we need to cut down our use of meat. So if that process can be given a fillip through the production of meat in a lab, then I think that's a good thing. I mean, I don't want to get drawn into the ethics of it, but I still think that's better than eating animals and growing them in inhumane conditions. And if you can get a way to reduce that quickly, then I think we should be working on it.
Do you think that there is an opportunity for governments do you think governments can make sustainable food cheaper through incentivization, through various schemes? Or do you think it is a fundamental system change that is needed?
Well, it's not an either or. The government's very good at sending policy signals that induce system changes. I think you need policy, you need standards, you need regulations, you need food standards, probably going in the opposite direction to what we're going to have post-Brexit, where we're going to have to allow US food in with much lower standards, and we're seeing that already. But the government will play a very, very important role in steering that change. And there are much more effective ways of farming than, intensive agriculture with, lots of fertilizers and chemicals poured out of a bag every year. So, renewable agricultural practices and the creation of new markets is something that the government has a very important role in inducing. And then I think following that, you get the systemic behavioral change, the Copenhagen example. People want different forms of agriculture, you'll produce it. And if you produce it and it's better for them and it meets government regulations, people will want it.
So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about air travel. And right now, air travel is a major offender in terms of climate change, in terms of emitting. And it is struggling. The aviation industry is struggling at the moment, and they're asking for bailouts and all sorts of things. But do you think that the aviation industry should be built up after this crisis? And if so, how in a sustainable way?
You're really good at honing in on all the conversations and issues that are tough nuts to crack, and which kind of some of the ethical. I rather wish you'd asked me about energy or about electric vehicles, and I'd have told you a story whereby, whether you care about the climate or not, we're going to get cheaper, better cars and cheaper, more efficient energy through renewables, through electric vehicles and so on. And it's completely win-win. And we needed a little bit of public subsidy to get those technologies over the hump. And now we're going to get a better world on all fronts. Aviation, a bit like land use, are some of the tougher nuts to crack, where there are much tougher trade-offs. I will confess, I probably am a little bit at odds with many of my colleagues insofar as my instinct has always been pro-aviation. I think to some extent, if it wasn't for climate change, we should probably subsidize it as a public good. I think it's a wonderful thing for people to be able to go and see other cultures, other places, other people. I think it's a wonderful thing for immigrants to be able to come and not only explore and witness your own culture, but engage in it economically. I'm all in favor, my instinct is in favor of as much freedom for people to move around and see the world and engage with the world as possible. And I think aviation enables that, quite apart from the sort of, the role it plays in trade, for example, both trade and services, getting people to meet together on a commercial level, but also people forget what's in the hold of a plane when you fly, which is an awful lot of the goods that you and I consume, which are flown around. Now, that would be in a world without climate change. That's not the world we live in. And of course, aviation is a significant contributor to global warming. Let's not overstate. Sometimes, if you were to gauge by the number of times climate change is mentioned, there's a picture of a tail fin on the news, you'd think it's probably the biggest cause. It's not actually. It's about 3-4% of global emissions, which is more or less the same as, for example, the routers and servers that power your computers. So it is a contributor, but it's not a huge one. The reason it matters so much is precisely why you're asking me this question, because it's growing rapidly, and the opportunities to substitute out to renewable technologies are much fewer. We will substitute out to renewable cars. We will substitute out to renewable energy. We're doing that. That ship has sailed. That tipping point has already been passed. But it's very difficult to see how we're going to do that with aviation. So what I would suggest is you have a programmed transition in aviation. First of all, you do have to charge for the damage that's done. So you need a price on emissions. That's going to mean more expensive travel. There's no way you're going to get fewer people to fly unless the price fully reflects the damage that flying actually does. And those that really want to can still pay that price. That might sound unethical, but actually, you could argue it's, let rich people who desperately need to fly pay money to the exchequer to address climate change. And if you want to save on that money, you have that choice to do so. But I think you also need a systematic plan to reduce emissions in the aviation sector through targeted standards, which again have to be set by government. So you have certain targets that have to be met by certain needs. The aviation industry will kick and scream. In fact, if they didn't, your target's not tough enough. It's what we've seen with cars. It's what we've seen with energy. It's, you always get resistance. No, we can never do that. That's going to cost far too much. Well, tough. And invariably they do. And what you find is not only do they meet these targets, they exceed them by a wide margin, because in getting there, they realize that they get a cheaper, more efficient product that's less dependent on its key cost base, which is fuel. That's the major cost if you're running an airline, is fuel. So how do you do that? Well, to begin with, you have to meet your target through things like offsets, which have to be officially credited, then that's not ideal. But you have intermediary targets in terms not only of lighter materials, which make planes much more efficient, but also moving towards, in the short run, hybrid aeroplanes, which we're already seeing being developed in short haul.
Are those half electric, half
That's
fuel?
exactly right. So you might use fuel, for example, for the takeoff, which is the bit you need a lot of fuel for. And then once you've reached a certain cruising altitude, you can just switch the engines off and the battery will run the plane. And a similar kind of thing at landing, where you don't need that much power. And eventually you'll move towards all electric aeroplanes. The rate at which you can convert power from, in particular from solar into energy, and the efficiency with which you do that is going up so quickly. We're already having, light aircraft that are fully electric that are able to fly. It's going to be, decades before you have anything of a commercial use that can do that, but you don't want to rule it out. And you want to get the innovation going quickly. And experience suggests that when you get serious players, serious money innovating, you deliver and you over-deliver. So I think, within our lifetimes, we will have commercial hybrid planes sooner than we think, probably in a matter of the next decade or two.
And those already exist at the moment?
Those already exist. And Boeing and Airbus are already building them. So these aren't sort of pipe dreams.
Okay.
They're going to start with short-haul small planes, and it'll be a while before you have wide-body long-haul planes that become hybrid, and then even longer before they become electric, but they will. And in the meantime, you're decarbonizing all the other much easier sectors. So, you've got this phased decarbonization where you tackle energy and transport, which are huge. You tackle buildings, which are also huge, and you tackle land use, which is also, all of these sectors are much bigger than aviation. So you make great progress on that. And in the background, you're also progressing on aviation. So that 3 or 4% that we've got now starts to dwindle. And if you do that, you can meet a net zero target.
Also, I wanted to talk a little bit, just quickly ask you about sort of alternative fuels and renewable fuels, such as I spoke to Climeworks in an earlier episode, the direct air capture company who suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and convert it to fuel and are selling to airlines. Do you think there is a market for renewable fuels and there is an opportunity there?
See, I'm not a technologist, but I wouldn't rule it out, because everything I've seen about technologies is that, they don't all come good. I don't even know what the percentage of technologies that come good are, but the ones that do come good really big. I've heard incredible stories about synthesizing hydrogen and creating synthetic fuels for planes, which is much better than biofuels. The problem with biofuels, of course, is they also compete for food and land. So synthetic fuels are a really important part of the jigsaw. But you see here that we have so many options. We're talking about synthetic fuels. We're talking about composite materials for lighter planes. We're talking about battery and solar technologies in hybrid. And these are the things which we're going to push, which will be the solution. which look fiendishly expensive right now. But frankly, 10 years ago, and it is just 10 years, not even 20, but 10 years ago, you'd have had the same response when talking about commercial vehicles, cars.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It was going to be a never in our generation are we going to have that except for the super rich. And the range and productivity would be so limited. 10 years ago, people were doubting the possibility of having a mass electric vehicle. Now it's pretty clear we are going to have mass electric vehicles, and we know that they're going to be cheaper and more efficient than without subsidies than combustion engines within the next decade or so. Big challenge is building the infrastructure, the electric charging infrastructure. But again, we're back to Copenhagen.
Yeah.
In 10, 20 years' time, we'll be saying, why do we have such great infrastructure? Well, everybody drives electrics. Why do they drive electrics? Well, because we've got the infrastructure. But it's also one of the reasons why we struggle to move away from combustion engines. You see, we've been locked into fossil fuel infrastructure, petrol stations and refineries and oil rigs and tankers and pipelines, all built to provide fuel for your car.
How long does an average electric car take to charge, out of interest? This is something I've always wondered.
So I'm really not an expert on this, so I defer to the experts. My anecdotal experience, talking to people who have electric vehicles, is that they can be a bit of a pain to charge. There's fast charging and there's slower charging, and it's fine in fact, it's great if you're using your car for local trips, but at the moment, the lack of infrastructure investment makes it very tricky to use cars for long trips. The range isn't quite good enough, and then you have to queue up at a petrol station for a limited number of slots, often with the wrong adapter available for your car. So these are all infrastructural teething problems that we're going to have to iron out. And early pioneers, of course, are the ones that pay the most for the cars because the technology costs haven't come down, and suffer the most from the lack of infrastructure. And that's exactly the point about the tipping set. You need to get some point, which we will get to, where people know that they can just sort of plug into this network, so to speak, in a way that doesn't make a noticeable difference to their lifestyles. They can just, if you want to drive to Swansea, you can drive to Swansea without it taking 11 hours because you've been stopping at so many petrol stations and recharging and all the rest of it. That's a tipping point we're at for electric vehicles. It's a tipping point we've passed for renewable energy, and it's a tipping point we will get to for aviation.
Yeah.
Of course, it's really important to recognise that the current crisis affords an opportunity for the government to make a lot of the changes necessary to decarbonise aviation, the kind of stuff that we've talked about, a precondition for any stimulus support or bailout funds.
Yeah.
And indeed, that principle can be applied more generally across the economy. The government must make clear that there will be no public money available unless companies seeking public support act credibly to decarbonise their activities on a meaningful timescale.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think improving the infrastructure for electric cars is down to governments, or is that down to corporations and consumer-led?
It's a very good point. It has to be strongly government-led because it's a network. All networked sectors, whether it's the railways or water or electricity, all the utilities, roads, transport, have a very strong role for government. Even when they're supposedly privatized, they're regulated very strongly by government, communications networks as well. And the reason is precisely because they have these network effects where if you want to change the network, no private sector individual is going to want to be the first to do it because you incur all the costs without the benefits. So you need some public support to do that. So this will be public sector driven. It will require infrastructural investment and public money, but it also requires standards and targets. And at the moment, the government has committed to abolishing new combustion engine cars by 2035. That's not far away. That's so the manufacturers have to prepare for that. And so they know that there's, no serious auto manufacturer at the moment is putting money into the combustion engine when it comes to research and development. It's all electric, right? A combustion engine is the sort of technology of the last century, and it's on its way out.
Hasn't Vauxhall stopped making combustion engines altogether now?
Volkswagen, not Volkswagen.
It was Volkswagen, yeah.
No, the Swedish manufacturer. Anyway, yes, increasingly they're all Volvo, I think, has stopped.
Oh yes, okay. Something beginning with V.
Yes, that's right. Yes, the German manufacturer's a bit slower because, of course, they've got a lot of assets in diesel and and petrol. So they want to sweat those a little bit longer. And you see these things. They're obvious. They're not kind of rocket science. They're obvious behavioral responses that different sectors have and different manufacturers have in wanting to kind of, prevent change in their sector if they have a, leading market presence in that sector. That's what you expect. And again, that's why you need government signals to show all manufacturers that, this is where we're going to end up, and you can pick and choose how you get there. So one by one, they're all going to stop producing. At least for the rich world, they're going to stop producing combustion engine cars. I suspect there will be a combustion engine car in sub-Saharan Africa, which will, be chugging along and be repaired and used very efficiently, even if the petrol it uses isn't efficient, well into this century, which is the wonderful part of the circular economy that the developed world has lost. We don't fix and repair things the way that poorer countries do. But anyway, that as an aside, the writing's on the wall for these, and country by country, there will be targets and mandates that will squeeze out the presence of combustion engine cars.
I wanted to quickly ask, what would you say, though, to companies and individuals who work in high carbon industries and who are basically relying on the burning of fossil fuels for their livelihood? What would you say to them?
Really good question, Tom. And that's absolutely right. A key part of this, and one of the, I've talked about sort of legacy and inertia in terms of companies and people and organizations and governments doing things the way they've always done them, even though it's obvious that there's a better way of doing it. Nobody wants to move first. The payoff to investing in low carbon is a function of whether everybody else does it. If everybody else does it, the costs are going to come down and the finances stop being niche and the market opportunities will grow, so you'll do it. But the very act of you doing it is what brings the costs down through learning and experience and creating the new networks and institutions. So it's back to that Copenhagen sort of reinforcing cycle which you want to tap into. But one has to recognize that, as with all change, it's not just climate, it's AI and big data and automation and all the rest of it. There will be winners and losers.
Yeah.
And the losers know exactly who they are, and they will lobby politicians, they will don yellow vests, they will hurl petrol bombs, they will, the taxi drivers might go on strike. You know the sort of the resistance, and a lot of it is absolutely genuine. If your livelihood depends on high carbon, then you're going to kick and scream because you don't want your livelihood undermined, however supposedly noble the change is meant to be. Now, in many cases, you can actually steal a march on your competitor in some of these high carbon sectors by doing things that are more efficient and more productive and best in class. A lot of steel producers and cement producers realize that if they're going to survive in a low carbon, resource efficient world, they've got to produce cement and steel in the most efficient low carbon way. And then they steal a march on their competitors because that's the steel and cement that the world is going to be able to buy. But there are some sectors, coal perhaps as an example, which just really have no future in a low carbon world. The world is littered with tin mines that are still full that got abandoned before they depleted the tin inside them. The world changes, the world moves on. You can't stop that change, but what you can do is make sure that you recognize the impact you have on livelihoods, and this is what's often referred to as a just transition, and ensure that you can retool, reskill people who otherwise won't be able to participate in the new economy. Again, this isn't just climate change, this is everything, all the big technological megatrends. People have got to have the means to be able to participate and make that change. And in some cases, it's going to mean compensation too. It's certainly going to mean enabling and ensuring institutions. The enabling institutions give you the skills and the means and the opportunities to better yourself, and the ensuring institutions say that, look, in that process, if you suffer a reduction in income, the state will help you with childcare costs, will help you with healthcare costs, will provide a social safety net to allow you to get through that change. Because otherwise, and we're seeing this with coronavirus in the US, it's been a problem because a lot of the people you needed to stay at home couldn't stay at home because they would lose their jobs. If they lose their jobs, they wouldn't get healthcare. So they went out and worked and spread the virus. There wasn't a sufficient degree of ensuring institutions to enable people to make the socially necessary change. And I think a big part of this story is how we invest in our institutions so that they are resilient enough and have capacity to cope with some of the changes and help people who are affected by these changes to have a better livelihood in the new economy.
I wanted to ask about hemp. And if you know much about it, a last episode of this podcast was all about hemp. And the hemp farmer I spoke to, Marcus McCabe, told me that pretty much anything that you can do with fossil fuel oil, you can do with hemp. There's no market for hemp at the moment, but it also can create carbon negative buildings. How can we create a market for things like hemp?
Tom, I don't know about the specifics of hemp. You help create a market by having standards, regulations, and also carbon pricing that encourage activities which are low carbon. And if hemp is one of those, it will have an advantage versus alternatives such as fossil fuel, which are. So, the nice thing certainly about carbon pricing, but also a lot of standards and regulations, they're non-discriminatory. They don't say exactly what you should do to meet the targets. You allow consumers and producers to respond accordingly and efficiently. So hemp may be part of that.
So you mean incentivizing low carbon industries and creating a higher tax on high carbon industries so that low carbon industries will emerge through taxation?
Well, taxation is one of them. It doesn't have to be taxation. It could be carbon trading. A price on carbon. If you don't price polluting activity, those activities will be overconsumed. It's like with anything. If you don't price it, we'll buy more of it, right? So, you've got to have a price for the damage that's done, but it's not just pricing, it's standards and regulations, it's procurement. The government needs to ensure that, it's a very powerful player. It's about a quarter of the consumption, this country's public consumption. So that the government has a very influential role in steering industries towards low carbon if it changes its procurement rules. And it's about support for R&D and innovation and also deployment as well. So you have a big toolkit that can be used, each addressing different what we call market failures that prevent change from taking place that would otherwise be in society's interests. The mix of all these policies have this very important benefit in that they help shape expectations. Consumers, but also investors, believe that this becomes an inevitable process, then you may as well just get going. So, the role of leadership and policy, business leadership, policy leadership, and civil society leadership, Extinction Rebellion, people protesting, people making their voices heard. These are all important parts of, making sure we get onto that virtuous cycle that we were talking about earlier.
So I suppose to finish off, I want to ask a little bit about hope. How likely do you think we will build a green economy and have a green recovery globally, really, in response to this crisis? How much faith do you have in our governments and our industries?
So let me give you my own personal take on this. I've been writing a lot about building back better, a lot about using the tragic disruption caused by this pandemic to ensure we don't go back to the old model of economic growth, which clearly failed, in favor of a new one, which is more resilient, more inclusive, and is more sustainable and ultimately efficient and productive in the long run. Now, I tried to do a similar thing after the great financial crash in 2008, and there was some uptake. But from my own personal experience, I really do sense that this time round there is a huge appetite for this stuff. I've been slightly blown away. You've struggled to get me to talk to you because I've been so snowed under with work, and the reason for that is that there is a real appetite, I think, this time from a lot of parties. To actually implement the changes that are necessary to build back better and to move to a different growth model. Now, of course, reality back to history and institution, the reality is that there will be a lot of inertia in the system as key players want to do things the way they've always done them. So enthusiasm and interest is different to application and deployment. But I am, at this stage, certainly hugely encouraged at the degree of interest that surrounds this topic. And I'm hopeful that will translate into some meaningful applications, some meaningful changes in policies and institutions. If not in all countries, then certainly in enough countries. And it's not just countries, it's states, it's cities, it's businesses, to implement changes so that we move closer across sectors to that critical mass on those tipping points that mean that, within a few decades, we won't be talking about the green economy and the rest of the economy. We won't be talking about green jobs and non-green jobs. The entire economy and all the jobs in it will be green. They will be low carbon. They will be resource efficient. Perhaps not green enough, but it's a process, and that process requires early action. It's the future's for us to build. It's not going to happen. So we shouldn't sit there fixating on trying to forecast it. Let's design it and lead it.
What a nice quote. What a nice quote to finish on. Thank you very much, Dimitri, for chatting to me and giving up your Sunday. That was Dimitri Zenghelis. If you'd like to hear a little bit more about Dimitri, do visit his website, dimitrizengelis.com, where you can watch some of his TED Talks. He is also on Twitter, @DimitriZ, with a capital Z. Now, one of the recurring themes over the course of each episode has been governments. And that might make some people out there feel a little bit helpless. People have said as much to me, what can I do? Well, if that is the case, writing to your local MP or whichever government representative you have if you are not in the UK is always an option, and engage with them about climate change and whatever issues, policies, infrastructure, subsidies, incentives, some of which you may have heard about or learnt about over the course of this podcast, whichever you feel they could implement. I am told that if enough people do that, they do listen. So, on that note, that brings me to the end of the 7th episode of Planet and the People and the end of the first series of Planet and the People. Thank you to those of you who've listened to the podcast all the way through. If you've only listened to this one, I would very much encourage you to go back and listen to some other episodes. We have some great chats with Hannah Wicks from Ecosia, the tree planting search engine, Honor Eldridge from the Sustainable Food Trust, all about what sustainable food looks like and how to make it a climate solution. Some great people. So, I'm now going to go away for a little while and gather together my next ream of guests. If you are listening to this podcast and you feel you would like to speak on the podcast, do please get in touch at Planet and the People on Facebook and Instagram, and at Planet and the P on Twitter. Same goes for if you are listening and you have some ideas about what topics you'd like me to explore in the next series. Do please get in touch with your ideas. You never know, I might be able to speak to my guests in person, in a room, and who knows where I'll be introducing each episode. I may continue on the country walks, but I might be able to do it from the top of the London Eye, or the top of the Shard, or in the beer garden of a pub. The heady opportunities are endless. So, on that note, I will say goodbye, and I will be back in the next few months. My name is Tom Ward Thomas, and this is Planet and the People.